Life had always seemed to move in predictable rhythms for Clara. The sprawling suburban home, the prestigious invitations, and the polished surface of her marriage to Victor painted a picture of perfection to the outside world. For nearly 20 years, they had built a life that seemed enviable. 2 kids now in college, high-paying careers, and vacations that graced the envy of their social circle. Yet beneath this veneer lay an unspoken emptiness that Clara could no longer ignore. Victor, a renowned architect, had an almost obsessive dedication to his craft. His designs were celebrated internationally, bringing him acclaim and financial security. But this success came at a cost. Late nights at the office, endless phone calls during dinner, and an emotional unavailability left Clara feeling like a ghost in her own marriage. Over the years, their shared moments dwindled, leaving her yearning for the days when they couldn't keep their hands off each other. It was during one of her lonely mornings, sipping coffee in their vast kitchen, that Clara decided to shake off her melancholy by revisiting an old passion: yoga. She signed up at a local wellness studio, hoping the physical activity would distract her mind. The instructor, Caleb, was a charming man in his mid-30s with a warm smile and an infectious enthusiasm for life. From the moment they met, his energy was magnetic. Clara found herself looking forward to his classes, not just for the serenity they promised, but for the way Caleb seemed to notice her in a way Victor hadn't in years. What began as casual exchanges after class evolved into friendly conversations. Caleb was attentive, often lingering to share stories about his adventurous travels or to compliment Clara on her progress in yoga. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. She started arriving early to class, her heart quickening when Caleb greeted her with his easy grin. The moment their connection tipped from innocent to something more was subtle. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Caleb asked if she wanted to grab a smoothie at the cafe next door. Clara hesitated, guilt pricking at her conscience, but her longing for connection outweighed her reservations. Over that simple, shared meal, Clara laughed more than she had in months. Caleb's presence was intoxicating, his attention filling a void she had tried to ignore. Days turned into weeks, and their interactions grew bolder. Coffee meetups turned into dinners, where they sat in dimly lit corners, sharing secrets that Clara had never dared voice. Even to Victor, Caleb made her feel alive in a way that terrified her. His compliments came effortlessly, reminding her of the woman she had been before life dulled her edges. One evening, after a long dinner, Caleb walked her to her car. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. Clara felt her breath hitch when he leaned closer, his hand brushing against hers. For a moment, time stood still. She should have pulled away, thought of Victor, their kids, the life they had built. But instead, she closed the gap, their lips meeting in a kiss that ignited a fire she thought had long been extinguished. That kiss became the turning point. Clara drove home that night with trembling hands, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt churned in her stomach, but it was accompanied by a rush of exhilaration she hadn't felt in years. Caleb's kiss was the spark that awakened something buried deep inside her, a craving for passion, for adventure, for more than the comfortable monotony her life with Victor had become. The next few days were a blur. Clara avoided Caleb's classes, too overwhelmed by her emotions to face him. But avoiding him only made her longing worse. Every quiet moment at home, every glance at Victor's preoccupied expression as he tapped away on his laptop, drove Clara deeper into her thoughts about Caleb. Her guilt was a shadow she couldn't shake, but her yearning for connection was louder. Eventually, Caleb reached out, a simple text: "I miss seeing you in class. Are you okay?" His concern melted Clara's defenses. She replied hesitantly at first, but their messages quickly turned into a late-night conversation that lasted for hours. By the end of it, Caleb had convinced her to meet him for coffee. "It's just a talk," he promised. But Clara knew there was no going back. Their meetings became a regular occurrence. They told themselves it was innocent, that they were simply 2 people connecting over shared interests. But as weeks passed, their bond deepened. Caleb was everything Victor wasn't: attentive, spontaneous, and emotionally available. With him, Clara could breathe. She could laugh without restraint and speak without feeling like her words were dismissed. Yet the double life Clara was leading began to take its toll. She became hyper-aware of her every move, paranoid that Victor might notice the subtle shifts in her behavior. She started dressing with more care, experimenting with bold colors and stylish cuts that had been absent from her wardrobe for years. Victor barely noticed, though. If anything, he seemed grateful for her renewed confidence, mistaking it for happiness rather than the secret it masked. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt conversation with Caleb, he suggested they take a weekend trip together. Clara's heart raced at the idea. It was a bold step, one that pushed the boundaries of their already fragile situation. But Caleb's insistence, his promise of a weekend filled with nothing but laughter and freedom, was too tempting to resist. She lied to Victor, saying she was attending a yoga retreat. It wasn't entirely false, she reasoned. There would be yoga involved. The guilt gnawed at her, but as she packed her bag and drove to meet Caleb, the excitement of their illicit adventure drowned out her inner conflict. The weekend was everything Caleb promised. They stayed at a quaint cabin by a serene lake, surrounded by towering pines and the calming sounds of nature. For those 2 days, Clara allowed herself to forget her responsibilities, her marriage, her life back home. Caleb cooked for her. They went on long walks, and they spent hours talking by the fire. It felt like a dream, intoxicating and dangerous all at once. But dreams, Clara knew, had to end. As she drove back home on Sunday evening, the weight of her choices settled heavily on her shoulders. Victor was waiting for her when she arrived, his face lighting up with genuine warmth as he asked about her trip. The contrast between his trust and her betrayal was unbearable. Clara tried to distance herself from Caleb after that weekend. She told him they needed to stop, that what they were doing was wrong. Caleb, hurt but understanding, agreed. For weeks, Clara threw herself into repairing her marriage. She planned date nights with Victor, made an effort to engage in his world, and even suggested they take a vacation together. But no matter how hard she tried, the spark she was searching for never materialized. Victor remained kind but distant, their conversations superficial, and their connection strained. Caleb, meanwhile, was never far from Clara's thoughts. Despite her resolve, she found herself checking her phone for messages from him, longing for the way he made her feel. It was a losing battle, one she knew she couldn't fight forever. Clara's attempts to salvage her marriage felt like trying to revive something that had already withered. She and Victor went through the motions, dinners, polite conversations, even a weekend getaway to the mountains. But there was an invisible wall between them, built from years of unspoken grievances and emotional neglect. Victor, ever the pragmatist, didn't seem to notice. He simply assumed their marriage was fine because nothing overtly wrong had ever been addressed. Clara's facade of a renewed marriage crumbled one rainy evening when Caleb's name flashed on her phone. It was just a simple message. "I miss you. Can we talk?" But it was enough to reignite everything she had tried to suppress. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before typing a hesitant reply. "We shouldn't." But even as she sent the message, Clara knew it was a lie. She wanted to talk to him, to feel the connection that had made her feel alive. Caleb didn't press further, but the door she had tried to close remained slightly ajar. A few days later, Clara found herself back in Caleb's yoga studio. She told herself it was innocent, that she was simply returning to a class she enjoyed. But the moment their eyes met, she knew it was more than that. Caleb's expression was a mix of surprise and longing, and Clara felt her resolve crumble. After class, Caleb approached her. "You're here," he said softly, his voice tinged with relief. "I shouldn't be," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb hesitated, then took a step closer. "I know this is complicated, Clara, but I can't stop thinking about you. I know you feel it too." His words cut through her defenses. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I do," she admitted, "but it doesn't make this right." For the next hour, they sat in the empty studio, talking about everything they had tried to ignore. Caleb shared his frustrations with their situation, his feelings of being caught in a limbo where he couldn't fully have Clara but couldn't let her go either. Clara, in turn, poured out her own fears and guilt, her longing for Caleb clashing with her loyalty to the life she had built with Victor. By the time they parted, nothing had been resolved, but something had shifted. Their connection was undeniable, and Clara knew she couldn't pretend otherwise. As their affair resumed, Clara became more adept at juggling her double life. She invented excuses for her absences, carefully orchestrated her time, and became increasingly skilled at hiding the truth from Victor. But the stress of maintaining the charade began to weigh on her. Every interaction with Victor felt like a test, every casual question a potential trap. She began to question whether she was losing herself in the process. One evening, as Clara sat alone in the kitchen, Victor walked in holding a glass of wine. He seemed unusually relaxed, a small smile playing on his lips. "I've been thinking," he said, taking a seat across from her. "We should take that trip to Italy we've always talked about. Just the two of us. What do you think?" Clara's heart sank. Italy had been a dream of theirs for years, a romantic escape they had often fantasized about but never acted on. Now, the thought of spending weeks alone with Victor filled her with dread. "That sounds wonderful," she lied, forcing a smile. "When were you thinking?" Victor shrugged. "I'll have to clear my schedule, but maybe next month." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't continue like this. Something had to give. The breaking point came a week later when Caleb, sensing her growing distress, confronted her. "You can't keep living like this, Clara," he said. "It's tearing you apart. You have to make a choice." Clara looked at him, her chest tightening. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I love what we have, Caleb, but the thought of destroying everything I've built with Victor, I don't know if I can do it." Caleb's expression softened. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I don't want to pressure you, but you deserve to be happy, and so does Victor. This isn't fair to any of us." His words stayed with her long after they parted. For days, Clara wrestled with her emotions, torn between her loyalty to Victor and her desire for Caleb. She began to notice the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Victor's puzzled looks when she seemed distracted, her own hesitation. When he tried to engage her in conversation one evening, Clara found herself staring at an old photo album. The images of her and Victor in their early years, laughing, carefree, deeply in love, brought tears to her eyes. She realized that while she couldn't erase the past, she couldn't continue living in its shadow either. With a heavy heart, Clara made her decision. She invited Victor to sit down with her in the living room, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. "Victor, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice quivering. Victor looked at her, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" Clara took a deep breath, the weight of her confession pressing down on her. "I haven't been honest with you. There's someone else." Victor froze, his expression shifting from concern to shock. His fingers tightened around the arm of the chair as he processed her words. "Someone else?" he repeated, his voice low and disbelieving. Clara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't plan it. I've been so lonely, Victor. For years, I felt like we've been living separate lives under the same roof." Victor leaned back, his face pale. "Who is it?" "It's not about him," Clara said quickly. "It's about us, about what we've lost." Victor's jaw tightened. "Don't tell me it's not about him. If there's someone else, it's about him. Who is it?" Clara hesitated, but she knew there was no point in lying. "His name is Caleb. He's my yoga instructor." Victor let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "A yoga instructor? Unbelievable. Is this some kind of midlife crisis, Clara? Did you think an affair would fix what's wrong with us?" Her tears spilled over. "I don't know what I thought. I just know that I've been unhappy for so long, and he made me feel alive again. But I'm not here to defend what I did. I'm here because you deserve the truth." Victor stood, pacing the room, his emotions roiling just beneath the surface. "The truth? You think this makes it better? Do you have any idea what you've done to us, to me?" Clara remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. We've been broken for years, Victor." Victor stopped pacing and turned to face her. And you think running to someone else is the answer? No, Clara said, her voice trembling. It wasn't the answer. It was a mistake, and I see that now. But it forced me to confront the reality of our marriage. We've been living like strangers, Victor. He stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. And what now? Do you expect me to just move past this, to act like it never happened? I don't expect anything, Clara said softly. I just needed you to know the truth. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out, together or apart. But we can't keep living a lie. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victor sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. Clara could see the war raging within him. The betrayal, the anger, and perhaps, somewhere deep down, the love they once shared. Finally, he spoke, his voice weary. I need time, Clara. I can't make sense of this right now. Clara nodded, relief and sadness washing over her simultaneously. Take all the time you need. I'll respect whatever you decide. In the weeks that followed, their home became a battlefield of unspoken tension. Victor retreated into himself, spending hours at the office or locked away in his study. Clara respected his need for space, but the distance between them was unbearable. She found herself questioning whether she had made the right choice in confessing, even though she knew she couldn't have lived with the deceit any longer. Caleb, meanwhile, had stepped back from their relationship. He respected Clara's decision to face the consequences of her actions and refrained from contacting her. While she missed him deeply, she also knew it was for the best. Their relationship had been a catalyst, not a solution. One evening, Victor surprised Clara by asking her to join him for dinner. They sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant, the weight of their shared history palpable between them. For the first time in weeks, they really talked. Victor shared his own struggles, admitting that he had been so consumed by work that he hadn't realized how disconnected they had become. I'm not excusing what you did, Victor said, his voice steady but firm. But I can see now that I played a part in this too. I've taken you for granted, Clara, and I'm sorry for that. Clara's heart ached at his words. I'm sorry too, for everything. I should have come to you sooner instead of looking for comfort elsewhere. Their conversation stretched late into the night, filled with raw honesty and painful truths. By the time they left the restaurant, there was no resolution, but there was a glimmer of understanding, a fragile thread connecting them once more. Over the following months, Clara and Victor began the arduous process of rebuilding their marriage. It wasn't easy. Trust was a delicate thing, and the scars of Clara's betrayal didn't fade overnight. They attended counseling together, where they confronted their issues head-on and learned to communicate in ways they hadn't before. Clara cut all ties with Caleb, focusing instead on rediscovering the connection she had once shared with Victor. There were setbacks, moments when doubt and resentment threatened to unravel their progress. But there were also moments of hope, shared laughter, quiet evenings, and small gestures that reminded them why they had chosen each other all those years ago. In time, their marriage transformed. It was no longer the picture-perfect illusion they had once projected to the world, but something real and imperfect. They had weathered a storm that could have destroyed them, emerging on the other side with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. Clara often reflected on the choices that had brought her to this point. She knew she would carry the weight of her actions for the rest of her life, but she also knew they had led her to a place of growth and healing. In facing her flaws and vulnerabilities, she had found the strength to fight for what truly mattered. And while the road ahead was uncertain, Clara and Victor walked it together, one step at a time, ready to face whatever came next.